Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another nonfiction review in November, which is why I'm wearing an extra layer here in the recording room. Welcome to my repeat viewers. To anyone viewing this channel for the first time, that strange RWYO logo and the number just beneath my picture, it stands for Read What You Own, which you may know is a BookTube challenge that anyone can participate in. And I pledged myself from the 1st of November that I would read nothing except books that I already own or books that I can borrow from my local library for the next 12 months. Because I just have so many books that I own and I have not read. I bought them on impulse, and then before I could read them, I bought some more on impulse, and then before I could read those. And that's how the problem starts. My hope is that this challenge will get me better acquainted with the really good books that I already own. What we are reviewing today is Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufmann, published in 2017 by One World Publications. Let's go straight to the first question. Could I summarize this book? This book is correcting history, or rather correcting a perception of history. Historians from the 1990s, like the Liverpool professor Paul Hare, argued that, quote, Africans were hardly at all known in England itself, Anglo-African contacts being almost exclusively within Guinea, and by Guinea he means they only met in West Africa. Kaufmann's research challenges and debunks this idea. She documents multiple written records of Africans who lived in Europe, but particularly in England, during the reigns of the Tudor kings and queens. Kaufmann chooses 10 individuals whose names, locations, occupations, and some biographical details are documented in English archives. She combines this information with her own detailed research into social custom, contemporary events, famous personalities who may have come in contact with her chosen subjects, plus any other facts that can lay the ground for educated speculation. And from that material, she fills out 10 life stories, which show Africans who seemingly lived and worked among the English, had freedom in as much as any working class English person had freedom, and who likely intermarried. Kaufmann suggests that English participation in the slave trade, which took over Spanish domination not long after the death of Elizabeth I, damaged what may have been a healthier attitude to human skin color. What is known about the author? Miranda Kaufmann was born in London in 1982. While she was reading history at Christ Church, Oxford, a casual remark by one of her lecturers caused her to realize that contact between English and Africans began earlier than her previous education had led her to believe. So she went to the library, did some private research, and discovered authors like Peter Fryer, who had revealed just how far back Black British history actually went. So then she decided to focus for her doctoral thesis on identifying these lives lived in Tudor England. She went back to the primary sources to glean a better idea of where Black people lived, how they worked, and how they were treated. It is, for her, an ongoing interest. Black Tudors was published in 2017 and was shortlisted for the Wolfson Prize for History in 2018. But only last month, Kaufmann and the historian David Olusoga jointly launched a MOOC, a massive open online course about Black Tudor history via the FutureLearn platform. But I will tell you more about that at the end of the review. Next question. How is the book structured? Well, in total, the paperback version of Black Tudors is 376 pages long, but I'll give you a handy table so you can see the breakdown. Of those pages, 267 are the text itself. There's 2 pages of acknowledgements, 33 pages of bibliography, 59 pages of notes, and a 9-page subject index. So that gives you an indication that Kaufmann's work would be a very helpful starting point if you wanted to do your own research. The text itself, that 267 pages, is divided into 10 chapters, each of which kind of zooms in on an individual life that Kaufmann was able to identify from the archives, and then she expands and tries to create a fuller story using research into the period. If you recall my review of Simon Mauer's book Ancestry, where Mauer takes the details of his personal family history research and then he attempts to imagine the lives of his forebears in their historical context, then the chapters of Kaufmann's book are very similar. Okay, so how did I get this book and how much did it cost? Well, this book was from my local library because, as I said at the top of this review, I've accepted the Read What You Own challenge from the 1st of November, and my aim for that was to read 50 books during that time, which can include library books, yes. However, because I'd signed out 3 library books before I made the decision to take the challenge, I didn't feel they should count as part of the 50. Don't know why. I guess I wanted to push myself a little, yeah, because otherwise it's not really a challenge, is it? And so just because I love boring statistics, you will see that I've added this on-screen counter, which will appear in all my videos going forward about the books that I've read, so that you and I, well, okay, let's be honest, mostly I, can keep track of my progress. So next question, why did I choose to read this book? Our local library is not large, and so the nonfiction section is not large. Every time I came to browse, and I'd say that's about once every 2 weeks, the spine of this book would catch my eye because the title font was metallic red on white. In fact, Kaufmann's publishers, One World Publications, I feel like they used the same concept that Penguin did with Sathnam Sangera's Empireland. They use a white background and then use the colors red and black because they're very striking, and that high contrast really does pull the eye and hold it. But more than that, this is part of an ongoing project of mine, which I wanted to do post-university because I felt, like many others, that Black history and Black literature is lacking from an education that otherwise had a lot of history and literature. That gap can't remain anymore. It needs filling, and this was just one other book that I felt was plugging a knowledge gap. Have I encountered anything unusual or unexpected? I chose Black Tudors because, like the author, I also did not know that a considerable number of Africans lived in England when the Tudor monarchs were in power. During my university course, there was one assignment which looked at the Kingdom of Benin in West Africa, and from which I learned about the beginnings of the slave trade in the 15th century, when Spain and Portugal were the first colonial Europeans to capture Africans as slaves. Most of the other European states were still fighting internal religious battles at that time, and they were just getting started with overseas exploration. Now, religious conflict appears to have had a peculiar effect in England. It meant that English xenophobia, which I was not surprised to find alive and well in the 16th century, well, it seemed to focus more on religious belief. This quote from page 130 of Kaufmann's book will sound disturbingly familiar to British listeners, but if you can, please bear with and keep listening to the end, because I think you'll find a little surprise. Others blamed immigrants for bringing the plague to London. The, quote, filthy keeping of foreigners' houses was identified by the city authorities as, quote, one of the greatest occasions of the plague. This might have helped to trigger the anti-immigrant feeling expressed by London apprentices in the spring of 1593. The trouble began in April when they set up a, quote, lewd and vile ticket or placard on a post in London threatening violence against the strangers. A series of, quote, divers, lewd, and malicious libels, published by some disordered and factious persons, appeared in the following weeks. One castigated the, quote, beastly brutes, the Belgians, and faint-hearted Flemings, and you, fraudulent father Frenchmen, and threatened that if they did not depart out of the realm by 9th July, more than 2,000 apprentices would rise up against them. So this quote comes from the chapter where Kaufmann is expanding on the life of an African silk weaver who's living in London with his family, who has lost 2 of his own children to the plague. By the time I reached this chapter, I was satisfied that the number of Black residents in the city would have been enough to be noticed. And so the fact that the apprentices focused their hatred on the Belgians, the Flemish, and the French, and make no mention of any other immigrant group, it's interesting. Does it mean that there was no race hatred in the city? I don't think you can draw a definite conclusion, but I think it would be unusual, just say, to find a contemporary example of English xenophobia that made no reference to non-white immigration. On the other hand, I found myself saying on the other hand, quite often when I was reading Kaufmann's book, but I get the impression that that's exactly what she would want, which I'll talk about later. On the other hand, the fact that hatred of immigrants seems to be just as much of a problem in England then as it has been in recent years, well, hate is never satisfied. It's a coping strategy for anyone who can't deal with the fact that the world is complex and problems are complex, and so it's always going to be looking for new enemies. Maybe there was no hatred expressed toward the Africans who lived in Tudor London. Maybe. But even if there wasn't, would the silkweaver and his family feel sure that it would stay that way? Next question. Is there anything readers should be prepared for if they're going to read this book? I say go in there and read critically. Miranda Kaufmann made this statement when she introduced her online course about the Black Tudors. She said, well, I think when you read a book, you sort of take it as read, and when you write a book, you have to kind of command an authorial voice and say, this is what happened. But in the course, we're going to revisit those questions. You're going to be able to look at the original sources yourselves, read about what different historians, how they've interpreted it, look at all those different perspectives and actually start to engage with those arguments yourselves, and in the discussion, discuss with other learners what you think the significance of the evidence is. I would say that for the sake of taking, a different look at Black history, Kaufmann's authorial voice that she talks about in her quote mainly favored positive interpretations of the evidence that she presents in the book. But her statement suggests that she wouldn't want anybody to settle for that. And there are lots of examples I could cite. My copy of Black Tudors, I still have it so I can hold it up for you. Can you see? It is bristling with post-it notes, markers of things that were quote-worthy and discussion-worthy, more so. But for the sake of not wasting too much time, I'll just mention one incident in 1596 when Edward Swarth, who was employed as a porter, he was an African employed by Sir Edward Winter, flogged an Englishman named John Guy, and was not prevented by those who witnessed the beating, and he was never punished. This is interesting because it would be near impossible to imagine the same scenario happening, say, in the American antebellum South. On the other hand, right, we've got to use that phrase. On the other hand, records do not tell us whether Swarth wanted to hurt John Guy. The person who did was his employer, Sir Edward Winter. The job of porter was like a security guard, and so in that capacity, it seems, Swarth was carrying out the orders of Sir Edward Winter to flog John Guy as punishment for Guy neglecting his duty as overseer of the estate's ironworks. So you could view the whipping, yes, as an unusual example of an African having the power to hurt a white man with impunity. Or you could argue that he was just an employee of a bullying employer, and if you look at Sir Edward Winter's life story, it's pretty damning that way. So you could just say that it was just a bully employer forcing a black servant to do his dirty work, a servant made to hurt a fellow servant, and probably having to deal with the reactions from the rest of Sir Edward's staff. As I say, that's just one example. It's not a criticism of Black Tudors, absolutely not. I think it's important that Miranda Kaufmann has done this research, presented the information. Otherwise, the popular perception of Black history would continue to be that relations between Africans and the English didn't really exist before 1619 and only consisted of the awful interactions that were necessary for the slave trade. But I also think that she would agree that her book is a starting point for discussion, rather than the way it was, if that makes sense. Is there anything else interesting to know about the book? Well, if you have English ancestry and you're reading Black Tudors, be prepared to read about a possible ancestor and have Black history become even more personally relevant. One branch of my English family tree are Locks. Now, there was a John Locke who captained one of the earliest English sea journeys to West Africa. He was looking for a way to capture some of the ivory and pepper trade from the Portuguese. I don't know if I am related to this John Locke, but I do know that the Locke ancestors owned land and wealth, and there's always a question, isn't there, of how they might have acquired that wealth. On a more minor note, I found out that English tutors could not swim. Nope, not even sailors. At the time, it was not considered a healthy thing to immerse the body in water. And for Tudor sailors, well, if they fell overboard at sea, those ships, with their sails, it wasn't easy to turn them around. And so that just wouldn't happen. And so it was considered that the best thing, if you fell overboard, was just to drown as quickly as possible. Okay, last question. Any ideas, suggestions for related or follow-up reading? Well, if you have not heard of FutureLearn, and by the way, this is not a sponsored announcement. I have taken quite a few FutureLearn courses, so this is just my personal enthusiasm talking. But it is an online learning site with more than 200 contributors from universities across the globe. And access to many of these courses are free, provided you can take them within a limited time period. And one of these is this Black Tudors course, which is being taught by the author Miranda Kaufmann and the historian David Olusoga. So you'll see there Kaufmann making space for that critical discussion about how we interpret the small amounts of information that we have in historical archives. Now, you'll see also how important Kaufmann's contribution is by reading the comments in that course from other students, in particular how many of them came to the course precisely because their schools or their universities did not properly teach Black history. So there'll be links to the course and also to Miranda Kaufmann's website in the description box if you're interested in these. Miranda Kaufmann also mentioned her debt personally to author Peter Fryer, who was writing works of Black history back in the 1980s and 1990s. They went out of print, but they've been recently revived. I recommend his book, Staying Power, The History of Black People in Britain, originally published in 1984. I can find some very reasonable secondhand copies online, so please do look out for those if you're interested. Okay, review done. Well, to sum up, this has been a really important bit of my Black history education. I've also learned that there have been Africans in England before the Tudor period, so I'll be looking out for reading material about that. Regarding fiction, I've also finished the novel Love and Other Demons by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Expect that to be the next review on this channel. Thanks everybody for joining me today. Look forward to next time. Take care. Bye-bye.